Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel for another deep dive.
Always exciting to be back.
Today we're going to be looking at something that we all use pretty much every day, but probably don't think too much about,
Yeah.
the US dollar.
It's kind of ubiquitous, right? We all have it.
Ubiquitous, exactly. And its history is fascinating.
Oh, absolutely.
It's got twists and turns, and we're going to be covering it all from the chaos of colonial currencies all the way up to the age of cryptocurrency.
The digital future, yeah.
So before we get started,
Yeah.
what sources are we looking at today for this deep dive?
We have got a great combination of sources today. Actually, we're going to be looking at two YouTube videos.
Okay.
One is from American Artifacts, and that one's going to give us a really good detailed timeline of the history of the dollar.
Perfect.
And the other one is from Weird History, which is going to give us a more thematic look at some of the dollar's evolution.
Oh, cool.
And then in addition to that, we have an article from the website LearnXYZ, which is going to give us a look at how the dollar is significant on a global scale today.
Awesome. So we're really covering a lot of ground here.
We are. It's going to be great.
You know, I was thinking about this the other day, and I was trying to remember, like, why is it called a dollar,
Yeah.
and how did it become so powerful? Like, those are two of the big questions I have going into this.
Yeah. And I think that you're going to be surprised by some of the answers that we find in these sources.
Okay.
So why don't we jump right in?
Yeah.
And we can start by going back to the very, very beginning to colonial America.
Right.
When things were very different in terms of currency.
Right. Total chaos, from what I understand.
It really was. It was total chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, we take it for granted today that we have like a unified currency that we all agree upon.
Right.
But back then, the colonists were really struggling. They were using all sorts of things.
Yeah, I was reading about that.
Yeah.
They were using, like, wampum and tobacco.
Yeah.
Like, all sorts of crazy things.
Yeah, beaver pelts. Anything you could think of that had some kind of value that you could exchange.
So how did they decide, like, what a beaver pelt was worth versus tobacco? Like, how did they even...
Can you imagine trying to make change with like a beaver pelt? It was not practical at all.
It wasn't working.
No.
It sounds like.
Not at all. And American Artifacts highlights that even wampum, which were these shell beads that were used by Native Americans,
Okay.
those were actually made legal tender by the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1637.
Wow. So they actually tried to make that work.
They did. They tried it. Yeah. And, it kind of shows you how desperate they were for some kind of stable currency.
Like, because those things fluctuate in value so much.
Exactly. And, while all this was happening, the British government was maintaining a very tight grip on the financial system in the colonies.
Right. I mean, because they were still under British rule.
Exactly. At the time. And so they banned the export of British currency to the colonies.
Oh, wow.
And they also forbade the colonies from minting their own coins.
So they were basically trying to control them through the money.
Exactly. And this is a key reason why the Spanish peso, also known as the Spanish dollar, became the most widely accepted currency in the colonies.
Oh, so that's where the name dollar comes from.
Precisely, yeah. American Artifacts traces the name all the way back to the thaler.
The thaler?
Thaler, yeah. It was a silver coin that was minted in Bohemia in the 16th century.
Okay.
And the word kind of evolved through various languages, and eventually it became dollar thanks to those Spanish pesos circulating throughout the colonies.
So the dollar is named after, like, a Bohemian silver mine, basically.
It all comes back to Bohemia. Pretty fascinating, right?
Yeah, that's wild. So, but this also fueled resentment against British control, right? Like, the colonists wanted to have their own currency.
Absolutely.
That makes sense.
Yeah. It was a major grievance leading up to the Revolution.
Yeah.
American Artifacts mentions that Benjamin Franklin actually pushed for a paper currency in 1729.
Oh, wow.
To address the shortage of coins in Philadelphia. And he even designed notes that had the motto, "Mind your business."
I love it.
Isn't that great? Which kind of shows you, like, his forward-thinking approach even back then.
Yeah, he was always kind of thinking outside the box.
Totally. But of course, the British saw this as a threat, and they quickly outlawed colonial paper money.
Well, yeah, from their perspective.
Yeah.
You got to keep control.
Exactly. And so you can see how this kind of economic control just exacerbated the political tensions that were already simmering.
Right. And obviously that all led to the American Revolution.
Exactly.
So where does the dollar fit into the picture after that happens?
Well, that's when the dollar's origin story really takes shape.
Okay.
Because the Continental Congress needed a way to finance the war.
Yeah.
And they turned to paper money.
Okay.
So in 1775, they issued the now infamous Continentals.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of those.
Yeah, American Artifacts explains that although these notes were initially valued at par with the Spanish dollar,
Okay.
massive printing led to rampant inflation,
Oh, no.
and their value just plummeted.
Oh, so they just printed too much of it.
Way too much.
That's how it always goes.
It's a classic tale.
That's where the phrase "not worth a Continental" comes from, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can just imagine the frustration of those early Americans who saw their savings evaporate.
Yeah, it's like it's got to be so demoralizing.
Oh, it was a harsh lesson in the perils of uncontrolled inflation.
Right.
And it really instilled a deep distrust of paper money among the Founding Fathers.
And that's probably why they avoided mentioning paper currency in the Constitution, right?
Exactly. It wasn't something they wanted to deal with. But as Weird History points out, practicality eventually won out.
Well, yeah, they needed something.
They did. And in 1785, they officially designated the dollar as the national currency.
So that's the big moment.
It was a pivotal moment.
The birth of the dollar.
The birth of the dollar, yeah. And they also adopted the decimal system,
Really?
which made the U.S. dollar the first decimal currency in the world.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Which was a groundbreaking innovation actually championed by Thomas Jefferson.
Okay, so he's the decimal guy.
He was the decimal guy. Love decimals.
Well, I always learn something new in these deep dives.
Me too.
So what happened next? They started minting coins.
Yeah, they established the U.S. Mint in 1792 in Philadelphia.
Okay.
And I love this little detail from American Artifacts.
Yeah.
That the first coins that were minted there intentionally avoided using portraits of leaders.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they opted for symbols instead, like liberty, victory, and freedom.
Interesting. So it was a very conscious choice.
It was a very deliberate statement reflecting the newly formed nation's rejection of monarchy.
That makes sense.
And their emphasis on democratic ideals.
So it's interesting how those early design choices still resonate with the dollar symbolism today.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think we have to talk about the next chapter here, which is wildcat banking.
Oh, yes. This is where things get really interesting.
This is where things get crazy.
So imagine a time when every bank could print its own money.
What? How did that even work?
It led to hundreds of different banknotes in circulation, each with their own unique design and fluctuating value.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It was chaos, according to Weird History.
So, like, I could go to one state and have my money be worth a certain amount and then go to the next state over.
Exactly.
And it would be totally different.
Yep. From 1837 to 1865, the U.S. lacked a national currency.
Wow.
So private banks filled the void by issuing their own banknotes, supposedly backed by their assets.
Okay, but were they really backed by assets?
So that's the thing. American Artifacts pointed out that these assets were often very dubious.
Oh, no.
Like real estate in remote areas or securities of questionable value.
So basically worthless?
Right, essentially, yeah. It was a system ripe for abuse.
And I'm assuming people abused it?
Oh, of course. Counterfeiters thrived. They were passing off fake notes as genuine.
Can you imagine trying to run a business in that kind of environment?
Yeah.
Like, you have no idea if the money you're getting is even real.
It must have been incredibly difficult.
So how did this whole wildcat era finally end?
Well, like many things in American history, the Civil War played a pivotal role.
Okay, how so?
The need to finance the war effort forced the federal government to regain control of currency issuance.
Okay, so they had to standardize it.
Exactly.
So that everyone was on the same page.
And that led to the National Bank Act of 1863, which attempted to standardize currency by imposing a hefty tax on state banknotes,
Okay.
effectively pushing them out of circulation.
Ah, so that's how they got rid of the wildcat banking.
Exactly.
So what came next?
This marked the return of federal paper money, the famous greenbacks.
Oh, the greenbacks?
Yep, and American Artifacts even shares a fun little fact about the man behind the first $1 bill.
Okay, who was that?
His name was Salmon P. Chase.
Salmon P. Chase?
He was Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury,
Okay.
and he decided to put his own portrait on the bill.
Wait, he put his own face on the money?
He did.
That's amazing.
It seems Mr. Chase had a bit of an ego.
Well, yeah, I mean, who would want to see their face on the dollar bill?
But here's the kicker. Years later, as a Supreme Court justice, he ruled against the government's right to issue paper money.
What? He reversed his own decision?
He did. It's a real plot twist.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. It really highlights the complex legal and economic debates surrounding paper money at the time.
Right, because at the time it was a very new concept.
Exactly.
So despite Chase's ruling, greenbacks became the standard, right?
They did. They paved the way for the dollar bills we use today.
That's amazing. So we've gone from like colonial chaos
Total chaos.
to wildcat banking
Oh, yeah.
to the return of federal currency. It's been quite a journey.
It has. But I think we should probably pause here for now.
Okay.
And we can pick up the story in part 2.
Sounds good. I'm ready for a break.
Me too. So before the break, we were talking about how the Civil War really brought about the return of a national currency.
Right. It was a pretty wild time to be alive back then with all that wildcat banking going on.
It really was. And speaking of wild times, we can't forget about the Nixon shock of 1971.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
Huge. It completely transformed the global financial landscape.
So for those of us who maybe weren't around back then or need a little refresher, what exactly was the Nixon shock?
Well, in a nutshell, President Nixon decided to end the dollar's convertibility to gold.
Wow, so he basically took the U.S. off the gold standard.
Exactly. American Artifacts describes this as making the dollar a freely floating fiat currency.
Fiat currency. Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm not entirely sure I understand what it means.
So essentially, it means that the dollar's value is no longer tied to a physical commodity like gold.
Okay.
Instead, its value is based on faith in the U.S. government and the strength of its economy.
So it's like a promise.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a piece of paper with no intrinsic value, but backed by a collective belief in the U.S. economic system.
That's a pretty big leap of faith.
It is. And this system has its critics, but it's proven to be remarkably resilient.
Well, the dollar is still the world's dominant currency, so I guess it's working.
Exactly. But getting back to the Nixon shock, what were some of the immediate consequences of this shift to a fiat currency system?
Yeah, I'm curious about that. Like, what happened right after that decision?
Well, one immediate consequence was a period of increased inflation in the U.S.
That makes sense. The dollar's value probably fluctuated more freely since it wasn't tied to gold anymore.
Exactly. And this created uncertainty in the markets and impacted the purchasing power of everyday Americans.
So how did the government deal with that? Did they just let inflation run wild?
No, they had to step in. The Federal Reserve had to take on a more active role in managing the money supply and interest rates.
Okay, so they had to find ways to control inflation and stabilize the currency.
Precisely. They developed new monetary policy tools and strategies to influence economic activity.
I bet that was a challenge.
Oh, it was a delicate balancing act, for sure. And on the global stage, there was a question of whether other countries would still trust the dollar without its gold backing.
Right, because if no one trusts the dollar, then it doesn't really matter how strong the U.S. economy is.
Exactly. But surprisingly, LearnXYZ highlights that the dollar's dominance actually strengthened in the years following the Nixon shock.
Really? That's interesting. I would have thought that it would have weakened.
It seems counterintuitive, but there were several factors at play.
Like what?
Well, one key factor was the sheer size and strength of the U.S. economy.
Okay, so even though there was inflation, the U.S. was still an economic powerhouse.
Exactly. And holding dollars still provided stability and liquidity for international trade and finance.
So basically, other countries still needed dollars, even if they weren't backed by gold.
Precisely. And another interesting point that LearnXYZ brought up was the emergence of the petrodollar system in the 1970s.
The petrodollar system, what's that?
Essentially, the U.S. struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, which was the world's largest oil producer at the time,
Okay.
to price oil exclusively in U.S. dollars.
Wow, so if you wanted to buy oil, you needed dollars.
Exactly. And this agreement, coupled with the growing global demand for oil, meant that countries needed dollars to purchase this essential commodity.
That's a brilliant move.
It was. It further bolstered the dollar's demand on the international market.
So the need for oil drove demand for dollars, which strengthened the dollar's position as the world's reserve currency.
Exactly. It was a self-reinforcing cycle.
Fascinating. So we've talked a lot about the economic forces at play, but I'm curious about the actual look of the dollar during this period.
Yeah, how did the design of the dollar evolve after we moved away from the gold standard?
Right, because we talked about how those early coins intentionally avoided portraits. Did that change with paper money?
It did. American Artifacts notes that with the move away from the gold standard, the imagery on U.S. dollar notes became unified.
Unified. How so?
They started depicting only faces of figures who were deemed trustworthy and capable of inspiring confidence.
So they wanted to project an image of stability and reliability, especially during a time of economic change.
Exactly. Presidents, statesmen, treasury secretaries, their portraits all aimed at reinforcing faith in the currency.
It's amazing how they can use imagery to shape people's perceptions.
It's a powerful tool. And speaking of imagery, Weird History had a really interesting segment about the security features that are incorporated into U.S. banknotes.
Oh, yeah, like the color-shifting ink and the watermark.
Exactly. It's a constant arms race against counterfeiters.
It makes you wonder how they even come up with those features.
The U.S. government invests heavily in protecting its currency.
Well, it makes sense.
Yeah.
They're trying to stay ahead of the counterfeiters.
Exactly. And they've implemented increasingly sophisticated technologies and design elements to do just that.
I remember reading that the average lifespan of a dollar bill is only about 3.5 years.
Yeah, that's right. Weird History attributes that to simple wear and tear.
Which makes sense when you think about how much a dollar bill gets handled.
Exactly. It passes through so many hands. Vending machines, cash registers, wallets, purses.
It's constantly being exchanged.
It really highlights how even the most powerful currency is still a physical object subject to the wear and tear of everyday use.
Right. And now with the rise of digital currencies, the future of physical cash is uncertain.
It's a really interesting time to be talking about the dollar because we're seeing the emergence of cryptocurrencies, central bank digital currencies.
It makes you wonder what the next chapter holds for the U.S. dollar.
It does.
Yeah.
And that's actually a perfect segue into our next topic.
So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for the dollar in this digital age?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And you know, one thing that LearnXYZ mentioned is that the Federal Reserve is exploring a potential digital dollar.
A digital dollar? What would that even look like?
It's a central bank digital currency, or CBDC.
BDDC.
Got it. And it could really revolutionize how we use money.
Would it be kind of like Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies?
That's a great question, and it's something that's still being debated. You know, some people envision a digital dollar that operates on a blockchain similar to cryptocurrencies,
Okay.
while others propose a more centralized system managed by the Federal Reserve.
So it could go either way.
Yeah, it's still early days.
But why is the Federal Reserve even considering this move? What are the potential upsides?
Well, there are a few key advantages that proponents point to. For starters, it could really increase financial inclusion.
Okay, how so?
Well, a lot of people lack access to traditional banking services, right?
Right.
But a digital dollar could make it easier and cheaper for them to participate in the financial system.
That makes sense. I mean, everyone has a phone these days.
Exactly. It could be a game changer for a lot of people.
And what about for those of us who do have bank accounts? Would a digital dollar change anything for us?
It could. A digital dollar could streamline payments and make cross-border transactions way faster and more efficient.
Okay, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah, and it could also reduce the risk of fraud and counterfeiting because digital transactions are much easier to track and verify.
Yeah, security is a big concern these days.
It is. So those are some of the potential benefits, but of course there are also concerns.
Like what?
Well, privacy is a big one. Critics worry that a digital dollar could give the government too much control over people's finances.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a concern.
They argue that with a digital dollar, every transaction could be tracked, and that could erode our privacy.
Right. It's like Big Brother watching your every move.
Exactly. So finding the right balance between security and privacy would be absolutely crucial for the success of a digital dollar.
It sounds like we're still a long way off from seeing a digital dollar in action.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex issue with a lot of moving parts.
So we've covered a lot of ground today, from the earliest forms of currency in colonial America to the possibility of a digital dollar in the future. What do you think is the most important takeaway from all of this?
You know, for me, the biggest takeaway is that the dollar is constantly evolving.
It's true. It's had to adapt to so many different challenges over the years.
From those commodity-based currencies to the gold standard to the current fiat system, the dollar has always found a way to adjust and meet the needs of the times.
And now we're on the verge of a potential digital revolution.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even the most established institutions and systems have to change to stay relevant.
So what does all of this mean for the average person? How should we be thinking about the future of money?
I think the key is to stay informed and engaged. Learn about the different forms of money, understand the forces that are driving change, and participate in the conversations about the future of our economic system.
That's great advice. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the changes, but knowledge is power.
Absolutely. The more we understand about money and its history, the better equipped we'll be to make informed decisions about our own finances and the future of our economy.
Well said. I think this deep dive has been incredibly insightful.
I agree. We've learned so much about the dollar and its journey.
A huge thank you to all of our listeners for joining us on this deep dive into the history of the U.S. dollar.
It's been a pleasure.
And don't forget to check out LearnXYZ-In for more information about the history of money and finance.
It's a fantastic resource.
You can also find links to all the sources we used for this episode in the show notes below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more insightful content. And be sure to visit that fantastic website, www.learnxyz.in. Until next time, keep those minds curious.